Hey guys! So today you and I are going to talk about documentation. So let's get into it. So the question in question was, hi Frederick, why are tech companies and developers against any form of documentation? How would you form a mental model of a code base when documentation is inadequate? I would look at the source. And then when I've figured out roughly what the dependencies are and all of these sorts of good things, I would ask for an introduction to the actual system itself. For example, I know that on average, every software team has at least two environments, which is usually the testing environment and the production environment. There might be more, so I just ask about those, and then I ask about like the product manager or whoever to, can you just show me how the product works? Because now I've worked for long enough that I can basically derive just from the source, and you don't need the whole source. Usually I just need to have a basic overview of like the dependencies and roughly like which cloud provider and stuff like that they're using, and then I can sort of derive from that, okay, so this is how the system is, how it's created. And then if there's like third-party dependencies or integrations and stuff like that, I usually need to take a look at those as well, or get a little bit of an introduction to, okay, so what data are we getting from them? And then, because then I know the tool stack, which is the whole process that I'm talking about is something that I call code inventory, where I always do that for every single team or every project I ever work in, where I go through all the stuff that I need to know in order to have a basic understanding of like what we're dealing with and so forth. I've said on many occasions, guys, and I still believe that that is the case. Unless you're working with a very small project, you're never, ever, ever going to be able to get a mental model for the whole code base. But the system as a whole is not that difficult if you have some experience, because as I said, like all of these tools that you're using and so forth, like basically every project is using them. And for me, like I don't need to know the nitty-gritty details of every single line of code that is in a project in order to know where the environments are, how they're being operated, like the macro of the stuff, so to speak, and what the purpose of the system is, and like these sorts of obvious things, high level stuff. If I have that, then I know enough to say that, well, I can work on this system, because then I can go into specific areas later on. And that's what I usually give as advice to new developers. Don't try to understand the whole system at the same time. You're never going to do that in a large system. Try to understand the big blocks of like the big pieces of technology that you're using. As I said, what cloud provider are hosting or things like that. So where like are all the environments and stuff like that, and what is the system actually designed to do, like the actual application in production and how the customers are consuming it in some way. Those things, with that you will have a pretty good idea. Because I would go as far, I will say this, I think that there's a assumption here that developers and companies are against documentation. They're not at all, in my experience at the very least. It's a question of that, well, it's human laziness, I usually say. It's the same phenomenon you will see as to why people have a hard time remembering going to the gym, or a hard time making sure that they brush their teeth or whatever, like these sorts of things where you're not necessarily forced to do it, but it's good for you if you do it. Some people are really good at keeping a schedule or writing documentation or remember to clean their apartments or houses or what have you, like these sort of things that you don't really prioritize on a regular day. It's really, I argue that's at least what I've seen. It's that simple. Developers they don't hate documentation. The only time they complain about documentation is usually when they want to learn something. But when you learn the thing and you know the thing, well, then very few people take the time to write the documentation because you already know it, right? And so you skip it because it's not critical to you. I like to describe it as it's not critical to your needs or your survival, if you want. Practically every human that I know prioritizes almost always things that feel to be like that has a sense of urgency, or like a sense of that has like their livelihood or something very primitive as survival connected to it, or something they really care about a lot. Very few people care enough about stuff that isn't critical to themselves in order to do something like maintain documentation. The tip I usually give to people is that if something is important and you know that it's always possible to skip it, like testing or doing code reviews or things like that, like these sorts of, you should be doing them, but you could in theory skip them, but it's bad if you skip them, make a budget for it. That's the easiest way I know. So for example, if we take something concrete for documentation, write the documentation like for the stuff that I usually say, the stuff that really is important. You're never going to be able to document all the things, but the stuff that, like, for example, where all the access, all your systems, the big stuff is, and roughly what types of like repetitive tasks and stuff like that that you might need to do and so forth. Write that down and then create a budget for reviewing that information. So I usually say once every month, every other month, every third, it doesn't matter what. And then you keep it updated. You basically just go over it on a regular basis with a calendar mark, like a calendar invite for the developers or so forth, just to keep the thing updated. And then you might find that you're outdated somewhere, or it might be that there's something missing and you need to add more stuff, or like new guides or something like that. I do the same thing for bugs, for example, where if you have a system that has a tendency to get a lot of bugs, then create a bug, like an error, like a bug budget, where you say that, all right, so if we're going to pay off all of these bugs that are in the system that are not completely high priority, because usually you fix the stuff that is critical immediately, as I said, but the stuff that is just sort of lying around and just creating a shittier system, and you want to make sure that you don't forget about all the stuff that's in the backlog, create a budget. Just talk to your stakeholders. I usually say 2 bugs, or like two bugs per like team or something like that, once a week, for example, or every 2 weeks. It doesn't really matter how big the bug is, the budget is. And then the QA, or if it's one of you guys who feel like, yeah, you just pick the two issues or something like that, put that in the backlog, and then when you finish those, you can take two more, and then 2 more, like, so you basically have a rotation on it. And it's the same deal with every single person who's ever been like overweight or something like that and wanted to get into shape, who succeeded, will tell you the same thing. You need to create a routine, a schedule, like something that makes you go and actually do the thing and make sure that you're consistent over time. And like a rotating schedule or a budget or something like that is a very efficient way of doing that. So what I want you to take away from this is that don't think at all that companies are against documentation, and developers are neither, because when it's about themselves, like something they care about, then they care about a lot about it. The reason why it usually doesn't get written is because usually people keep everything in their head, and because the people who already know everything, they don't feel the need to write it down for other people. And so that's why I tell people, like, you have to work that into your teams if you want to have any meaningful documentation, and then create a bit of refresher rotation or a schedule or something like that. So make sure that you actually go and keep it updated, because documentation that is outdated is basically useless. Well, not 100%, but it's pretty bad if it gets outdated. And as for creating a mental model of the code base with documentation, you can kiss that idea completely. You can wave it goodbye completely. I have, to this day, in all the years I've ever worked, never been to a project that had such adequate documentation that it made me understand the whole system. Even if they have like really good documentation, it's pretty hard to figure out all the nitty-gritty details of how a system works. And I usually say, try to do an inventory instead, which is to focus on getting the really big stuff in place. So for example, main technologies and dependencies and stuff like that from the source. Get to know like the cloud infrastructure, the environments, how you deploy into like your various environments and what those environments are and how you have access and like so forth and so forth. And then of course an introduction to the system itself, so you sort of know what product you are building and what type of customers you have. These are the main three things I usually go for, because if I have that stuff, then I know the macro, and then the micro you will learn by just working on the project. Every time you close a story or do something, you will learn something new about the system. That's more, I argue, it's more efficient, because it's basically impossible to know the whole system, especially from just reading documentation. Have a great day.